I need help, guys. I think I can talk to dead people. Or at least one dead person. Right now, he's sitting in my living room, leaning slightly to the left, loudly complaining about how his son-in-law installed a ceiling fan wrong back in 2009, like it's still ruining his life. I think I'm losing my mind. That's why I'm posting here. I don't know who else to talk to. You guys deal with weird stuff. I'm not expecting you to have all the answers, but maybe you'll have some advice. And at the very least, people here might actually take me seriously. Maybe I just need an outside perspective. The only person I can really talk to about this is definitely biased. Let me explain a little about my life and the chain of events that led to me digging up and stealing the body of an elderly man I barely knew when he was alive. I'm going to include as many details as I can because I honestly have no idea what matters here, but for obvious reasons, I need to avoid giving any identifying information. Up until recently, my life was quiet and painfully ordinary. I'm 32 years old, and I've had crippling social anxiety for as long as I can remember. Not the normal kind people joke about before presentations. I mean the kind where your throat closes up if someone asks you a simple question. The kind where you stand in a pharmacy rehearsing sentences on your phone so you can figure out how to speak to the cashier. Ordering pizza over the phone feels like negotiating with terrorists. When I was a kid, my parents told me to just be more confident. I tried. I learned how to make myself small, only speak when spoken to, and stay out of the way whenever possible. I never figured out how to make friends. The few people I knew growing up eventually moved away. Keeping in touch with me was difficult, and reaching out to them felt impossible. Every text message I tried to send sat in my drafts for 3 days before I reread it, cringed at every word, and deleted it. It's been years since I last talked to any of them. I still live in the same small town where I grew up, and I work at the same hospital where I was born. I work night shifts as a nursing assistant, helping patients who are too sick or too old to take care of themselves. Honestly, I like the job. There's something quiet and comforting about being useful when someone's suffering. Plus, during night shifts, people are usually asleep or too exhausted for small talk. Outside of work, my life is calm and predictable. I keep to myself and waste time in whatever quiet, low-effort ways I can find. Scrolling through the same apps until my eyes hurt, microwaving the same frozen dinners. Rewatching familiar TV shows so I don't have to think too hard, and letting the days blur together. It's not the life I imagined as a kid, but it pays the rent and keeps the lights on. I come home to an empty apartment, eat microwaved Salisbury steak dinners, and fall asleep with my laptop glowing beside me. I kept telling myself it was fine, until I met Earl. He was admitted about a month before he died. Elderly man, late 70s, heart problems the doctors initially described with cautious optimism before they stopped talking about it altogether. Sometimes we'd chat a little, nothing important. He liked old westerns and talked about his grandkids, complained about the food, asked questions about my life that I answered as briefly as possible while staying technically polite. He was just an ordinary old man dying in a hospital bed. You try not to think about that too much. You just do your job and try to make someone's last days a little more comfortable. About 2 weeks ago, I was standing with my back to him checking an IV line while he rambled about either a dog he had as a child or a neighbor who bit a mailman. I wasn't paying much attention. Then I heard a wet cracking sound. Then silence. The heart monitor suddenly released one long, flat tone. Code blue. The room filled with doctors. I stepped back against the wall, stunned by how fast everything moved. I watched them crowd around him, doing chest compressions, shouting numbers, and I felt that horrible, heavy stillness that comes when you realize you're watching life leave a body. I'd never actually seen someone die before, and it hit me harder than I expected. It felt deeply unfair, so sudden, so pathetic and undignified that a person's entire life could just end like that in a cold room practically alone. I just stood there staring. Then I heard his voice. "Why's that woman jabbing me in the ribs?" he asked irritably. I flinched and stepped forward, trying to see him. Maybe the machines were wrong and he was somehow still alive. But the doctors were still working on his body. Earl's eyes were glassy, his mouth hung open, and the monitors kept screaming. But I could hear him just as clearly as before. "Are you people deaf or just stupid?" I made some kind of choking noise. One of the nurse. "You okay?" I muttered something about thinking I heard him speak, and she gave me a sympathetic nod. Stress response. It happens sometimes. I was too shocked to explain that I could still hear him, and that he was getting louder the more irritated he became about being ignored. By now, he'd launched into a full rant about the goddamn circus happening in his room. I didn't say anything else. Either I was having a psychotic break, or I could hear dead people. Neither option felt safe to mention to my supervisor. I liked my job, and if I was going to spend the rest of my life hearing ghosts, I'd prefer to do it with dental insurance. The doctors worked on Earl for nearly 20 minutes before they finally stopped. He died. They covered him with a sheet and wheeled him out of the room while he continued yelling about calling his lawyer. I could still hear his voice fading down the hallway as they rolled him away. I stood there in the empty room surrounded by the dull hum of fluorescent lights. I always thought paranormal experiences involved creepy, long-haired children crawling out of televisions or Ouija boards or something. Not a grumpy 78-year-old man complaining about customer service. Maybe it was shock, but I felt strangely calm. That numb, heavy calm you feel right after a car accident. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I moved mechanically through my tasks, checking vitals, repositioning patients too weak to move themselves, emptying bedpans. Earl's voice still echoed in the back of my mind. Every time a call light went off, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Part of me expected it to be him calling from a room he no longer occupied. When I finally got off work at 7 in the morning, the sunrise brought me absolutely no comfort. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence inside the car felt dense and wrong. I spent the next 14 hours in a state of pure existential terror. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glassy, dead eyes staring upward. I could still faintly hear him complaining about terrible patient care. By the beginning of my next shift, doubt was eating me alive. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I needed proof. I needed to see his cold, silent body and reassure myself that I was just exhausted and hallucinating. Maybe I was sleep-deprived. Maybe I'd watched too many horror movies. My plan was simple. Walk in, see the body, hear nothing, cry hysterically in my car afterward, and finally call the therapist I'd been avoiding for the last 2 years. Earl's family lived out of state, so his body was still in the morgue while funeral arrangements were being handled. During my next shift, I slipped downstairs during my break, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. He was there, cold, stiff. His skin had that bluish-gray tint dead bodies get. I reached out and touched his wrist. It felt like touching refrigerated meat. No pulse, no breathing, no voice. "Thank God," I whispered, actually laughing in relief. "Oh, it's you again," Earl snapped. "You got any mints? My mouth tastes like old socks." "Jesus Christ," I whispered. We talked in the morgue for nearly half an hour, while I whispered back and nervously checked the door every 30 seconds, expecting security or a coroner to walk in and catch me having a conversation with a corpse. I told Earl he was dead, and honestly, he handled it surprisingly well considering the circumstances. Asked if he could get a second opinion, but since I literally watched him die, I told him the diagnosis was probably accurate. "Well," he grumbled. "Figured it'd happen eventually. Just thought there'd be more harps, maybe a buffet." I explained that I seemed to be the only person who could hear him, and he asked if I'd ever considered becoming a detective. I asked him a million questions about his life to test whether this was somehow real. I even pulled out my phone and searched for his obituary while leaning against the cold metal shelving. I think part of me wanted to prove this was some elaborate delusion, but every detail matched. His daughter's name, his insurance career, a grainy photograph of him holding a trophy for Best Hybrid Tea Rose 2014. Everything he told me was accurate, right down to the names in the guest book from people I had obviously never met. Holy shit, I sighed quietly, finally beginning to accept it. My break was almost over. I told Earl I needed to get back to work. That's when he panicked. He didn't want to be buried. He begged me to get him out of there, pleaded with me. He didn't understand what was happening, but he couldn't bear the thought of ending up trapped in a coffin if this was going to continue forever. Alone, in total darkness. Maybe permanently. Please, kid. I don't want to be down there. Not like this. His voice sounded terrified. Not like a monster or a ghost, just an old man horrified by the crushing thought of spending eternity sealed inside a dark wooden box. It was a horrifying thing to imagine. I pictured him screaming helplessly into velvet lining for decades. Every rational part of my brain screamed no, but my mouth betrayed me anyway. I'll figure something out, I heard myself say. It took the rest of the shift for the weight of that promise to truly hit me. Sitting in my car afterward, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For 10 solid minutes, I stared at the hospital exit sign with the engine idling, trying to understand at what exact point I had accidentally become the protagonist of a horror movie. My Tuesday was not supposed to go like this. "What the hell did I just agree to?" I whispered to the empty passenger seat. There was no answer. Not yet. Part of me still hoped I was losing my mind. I could have just let him be buried like a normal person. I should have gone home and forgotten all about this. But I couldn't stop thinking about an old, terrified man lying conscious and alone somewhere. Nobody could hear him. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I left him down there to rot in total isolation. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't steal the body before the funeral. Someone would definitely notice. I had to wait until afterward, which meant I was going to have to dig up a corpse. Fantastic. Who even does that anymore besides complete psychopaths? I was going to become a criminal. I spent hours pacing around my apartment and panicking. According to the obituary in the local newspaper, the funeral service would be Wednesday afternoon. That gave me one day. I attended the funeral, watched where they buried him, and tried to memorize everything while also attempting to look like a perfectly normal, grieving acquaintance. The service was short and surprisingly crowded, considering how aggressively Earl argued with nearly everything people said about him. I watched his family wipe away tears and hold each other tightly, unable to let him go. If only they knew. That same night, I returned with a shovel I'd bought from a hardware store 2 towns over using cash. The entire drive there, I kept telling myself I'd arrive, come to my senses, and turn around. I didn't turn around. I parked, stepped out of the car with a duffel bag over my shoulder and a shovel in my hand. Dressed exactly like a man who absolutely should not be wandering around a cemetery after midnight. The cemetery gates were locked. I told myself that was probably for the best. That this was where the universe intervened. That I should just go home. That I'd had some kind of breakdown after the morgue and needed sleep. That this was stress-induced psychosis. Or maybe Earl had already gone silent and his stubborn ass had finally moved on to the afterlife. I tossed my bag over the fence and climbed after it. I landed awkwardly in the soft dirt on the other side. Something rustled loudly nearby in the darkness. I froze, terrified someone had heard me. A raccoon sat on top of a gravestone, staring at me judgmentally. I stared back. We both continued with our evenings. I made my way toward Earl's grave. My shovel bit into the dirt. Before I'd even broken through the top layer of soil, I heard Earl's voice booming loudly nearby. I looked around to make sure I was alone, but nobody seemed to be watching me. Digging him up was physically miserable. My lungs burned, my hands blistered, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but thankfully the grave was still freshly packed and loose. Eventually, I pried open the coffin lid. To my relief, it wasn't locked. Apparently, society operates under the assumption that dead people generally behave themselves. "You actually came! I was starting to think you chickened out," Earl said with such genuine happiness that something tightened painfully in my chest. Then, after a brief pause, "Do I look like they use too much blush?" "I specifically told my daughter not to let them use blush." I muttered that I hadn't noticed. "Well, look. I'm not doing this right now, Earl. I'm currently committing grave robbery. I need you to..." Quick glance. 2 seconds. I looked. They had absolutely used too much blush. "Yeah," I admitted. "I knew it," he said bitterly. I wrapped him in a tarp while trying very hard not to think about what I was physically touching and dragged him out of the grave. Then I shakily filled the hole back in and tamped the dirt down with my feet so it wouldn't look freshly disturbed. I returned to the cemetery fence and hauled him over it in frantic, panicked bursts, stopping every few seconds to listen for approaching footsteps. "No rush, kid. Not like I'm going anywhere," Earl commented helpfully. Eventually, I got him into the back seat of my car and drove home while obeying every speed limit and traffic law with absolute precision. My neighbor Gary's Ring doorbell camera undoubtedly captured footage of me dragging a large, suspiciously human-shaped object into my apartment at 2 a.m. I sat Earl upright on my couch like some deeply upsetting decorative pillow. Then I went into the kitchen, ate a bowl of cereal, and experienced profound regret over every decision that had led me to this exact moment. Each one felt like a catastrophic mistake I would never be able to undo. "You got cable?" Earl called from the living room. That was about a week ago. Every morning since then, I wake up convinced that when I walk into the living room, I'm finally going to find a silent, decaying corpse collapsed on my couch. And technically I do, except he never shuts up. Usually he's already halfway through a rant about how modern television is garbage. So that's where things stand. And honestly, this part is going to sound deeply messed up, but it's actually kind of nice. For the first time in years, I come home to someone who wants to hear about my day. He listens, he asks questions. I didn't realize how desperately I missed that, having someone around who doesn't make me feel like I'm performing a role. We're trauma bonded now. He literally watched me at my absolute psychological worst, so there's no pressure to pretend I'm normal anymore. I can just exist. He's opinionated and grumpy about absolutely everything, but he's the first person in over a decade who refuses to let me disappear into my own head. I've also managed to get him interested in television beyond just Gunsmoke. He's become weirdly invested in the Great British Bake Off. He always pretends he doesn't care who wins, but during judging he gets very quiet and intensely focused. We play gin rummy. He cheats. I know he cheats. Don't ask me how. Obviously, not everything has been going smoothly. Here are the major problems I'm currently dealing with. The smell. Oh God, the smell. If you've ever wondered what it's like to live inside a dumpster full of raw chicken left out beneath the July sun, and then attempt to mask it with a single optimistic spray of Febreze Linen Fresh, let me assure you, you never get used to it. The smell of rot has embedded itself into my apartment like it's paying rent. For the first couple of days, it was faint, like that suspicious odor in your refrigerator when you're staring at meat, wondering whether it's still edible or whether eating it would count as a suicide attempt. Then it bloomed. By day 4 or 5, it had saturated everything. The couch fabric absorbed it like cheap wine. My curtains now smell like someone wrapped a dead skunk in them. I've washed my clothes 3 separate times with the strongest detergent I could find, but by the time I put them on, the smell somehow comes back. I've tried everything short of arson. Industrial odor eliminators only transformed the smell into something chemical and horrifying instead of merely horrifying. dumping baking soda everywhere made my apartment look like a drug den. I even built a cheap homemade air purifier using charcoal filters. But it just sits there wheezing like it's personally offended by the air quality. My neighbor Gary has started lingering suspiciously in the hallway outside my apartment. I casually mentioned that I thought something had died inside the walls, which technically isn't entirely inaccurate, and he nodded slowly. I'm not convinced he believed me. I need help before I completely lose my mind. And probably go to prison. At minimum, somebody please tell me how to deal with the smell. There's another problem too. Earl requires constant attention. He never sleeps, which means I no longer have privacy. At all. I'll stop there. He also has strong opinions about everything and refuses to stop sharing them. The weather, my eating habits, the way I live, my furniture arrangement, everything. And something new has started happening lately that I really don't want to think too hard about. It started small. Twice now I've been watching television and my arm has suddenly twitched, hard, violently. The first time happened when someone on a cooking show insulted pot roast. The second happened during an episode of Gunsmoke when a deputy sheriff apparently did something Earl considered personally offensive. Both times I looked over at him. He was completely motionless, exactly as always, staring straight ahead. But somehow his posture looked smug. "Did you do that?" I asked the second time. A pause. "Do what?" "Move my arm. Arms are supposed to move," Earl said. "That's kind of their whole thing." I let the subject drop because I didn't really have a counter-argument, and also because I desperately did not want to continue whatever conversation would follow. I've tried approaching this scientifically. I've done every test I can think of to prove I'm not hallucinating. I'll leave the apartment to buy groceries, ask Earl what happened while I was gone, and then quietly verify it on IMDb afterward. He's always right. I also verified basically every detail of his life. One day, I even drove past his old house like a complete stalker, but everything matched his stories exactly, right down to the crooked mailbox. Here's what I've ruled out so far. He isn't a demon. That was actually the first thing I checked, because I've seen enough horror movies to understand it would be irresponsible not to. In hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have dug up a corpse and brought it home just because it asked politely, but hindsight is 20/20. I found an online Vatican gift shop and ordered several small bottles of holy water supposedly blessed by the Pope himself, which, by the way, was an unexpectedly time-consuming process. I poured the water into a spray bottle and aggressively misted Earl while he was watching Gunsmoke, hoping for some kind of dramatic reaction. Screaming. Melting. Maybe levitating off the couch. Instead, he just rolled his eyes. "I'm not a houseplant," he said irritably. "Relax," I told him. "I'm just checking to see if you're a demon." "With a spray bottle?" he asked after a pause. "Yes." "I think I'd know if I was a goddamn demon," Earl replied. "Would you tell me?" "Fair point," he admitted. "Since we were already committed to the bit, I pulled out the cross I'd panic bought because I needed $40 for free shipping. I held it up and tried reading excerpts from a WikiHow article titled "How to Exorcise a Demon" off my phone. Nothing happened. I tried touching him with the cross. I hung it around his neck. The only result was Earl commenting that it looked pretty stylish. So either Earl was genuine, or Catholicism simply wasn't equipped to deal with whatever this situation was. And honestly, I wasn't motivated enough to work my way through every major and minor religion trying to narrow it down. So I settled on the conclusion that he wasn't a demon or evil spirit. Just an incredibly annoying dead man. I also tried burning sage, but that only triggered the smoke alarm and caused my neighbor to pound on my door. I had to explain that I was cooking, which even I didn't find convincing. Maybe he has unfinished business. We've talked about that a lot. By every objective measure, Earl lived a full and decent life. He did right by his family. He said the things he needed to say. He doesn't seem to have unresolved grudges or obvious regrets. And yet, every time I tell him I can't fulfill one of his requests, he stares at me thoughtfully and says, maybe that's what's keeping him here. Maybe my refusal to drive past his old house on a Tuesday night to check whether the new owners are watering the hydrangeas properly is the one thing preventing him from achieving eternal peace. I told him, that's not how unfinished business works. He asked, how do you know? I answered, I don't. Here's what I still haven't figured out. How am I supposed to help him? The biggest issue, obviously, is slowing the decomposition. I've started researching body preservation methods. Earl suggested taxidermy and seemed disturbingly enthusiastic about the idea of having his head mounted on the wall like a hunting trophy. Which brings me to another horrifying question. How connected is his soul to his body? As nauseating as this thought is, if I cut his head off, would that kill him? Is it even possible to kill him worse than he already is? What about cremation? I can't exactly take him to a funeral home without answering several deeply uncomfortable questions, and I doubt I'm capable of building a bonfire hot enough to properly cremate a human body myself, so that option is probably off the table anyway. But I genuinely don't know whether cremation would free him or simply transform him into an extremely opinionated pile of ashes. We've discussed possibilities. I've even considered running small controlled experiments involving the removal of minor body parts, though I'm deeply unhappy about it. The idea alone makes me physically ill. Theoretically, I could remove one of his eyes, and if he can still see through it afterward, then we'd at least learn something useful about how this works. Worst case scenario, he loses an eye but retains vision in the other one, which would tell us bodily damage has consequences. Either way, his eyes, like the rest of him, are already decomposing, so time isn't exactly on our side. He insists his blue eyes are his best feature. Personally, I disagree, considering they currently resemble overripe grapes. But I may have to test this eventually, because otherwise the long-term solution might literally involve storing him in my freezer. And the question that bothers me most, can I only hear Earl, or can I hear other dead people too? Testing that is significantly harder. I'm not enthusiastic about becoming a repeat grave robber. And if I can hear other dead people, am I morally obligated to? The thought of someone else lying conscious and trapped underground in total darkness and isolation horrifies me. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. There's another idea I keep circling back to, one I can't stop thinking about. Actually, it was Earl's idea. He keeps bringing it up. There are unsolved missing persons cases, he says. Unidentified bodies. Murder victims nobody ever gave names to. He thinks maybe I could give them a voice. That maybe this whole thing is some kind of gift from God. And I've thought about that a lot more than I'm comfortable admitting. It's insane, but the idea keeps returning. Maybe there really are people who could never be identified any other way. Maybe I could actually help. There's been a series of murders not too far from here, and theoretically, if one of the victims could still talk, maybe they could tell me who killed them. I think Earl means well, but he doesn't have to deal with what any of that would actually involve. Honestly, I think he's also just bored and lonely. I'm the only person he can talk to. The second I leave for work, he's stuck alone in my apartment with nothing except late-night television and his own thoughts. He wants me to find others like him, but that raises another horrifying question. What happens if I do? If other corpses are conscious too, trapped inside dead bodies, aware and capable of conversation, then I can't imagine any of them would willingly agree to remain buried once they realized another option existed besides eternal isolation inside a wooden box underground. I already have one decomposing roommate, and I'm barely managing that situation. I am not physically, emotionally, legally, or spiritually prepared to open a halfway house for the recently deceased. I cannot start collecting additional dead people. I don't have the space. I realize I should probably have a more coherent plan by now, but it's difficult to strategize when the central problem is, what ethical obligations do I owe a talking corpse? And I can't exactly throw Earl away. Until we figure out what happens next, reburying him feels cruel, and he is strongly opposed to the idea. I explained all of this to him, and he mostly agreed except for the parts where he didn't, which is most of them. Also, despite everything, I'm starting to genuinely like him. I don't tell him that. So there it is. That's the full situation. Like I said, I need advice. Feel free to ask questions. I'm not going to share anything that could identify me, but otherwise, I'll answer what I can. I doubt any of you have dealt with something exactly like this before, but honestly, I'd appreciate any guidance at all. Paranormal advice, coping mechanisms, theories about what might happen next, or even practical tips for living with a roommate who never leaves the couch. I told Earl I was writing this post and he laughed harder than I've heard him laugh all week. He says to tell all of you that Gunsmoke is a classic and you should all watch it more often. P.S. Earl says he thinks his grandkids use Reddit, so if you're reading this, I'm sorry I dug up your grandfather. In my defense, he was extremely persuasive.